Hey guys, what's up, Zyphlin here, and today I just wanted to explain elemental damage like as easy as possible. Just make it as easy as possible for people who watch this video to understand, basically, and like give you guys a few quick tips as to what elemental mods you should be running in your weapons to do more damage versus what factions and why. So I guess without further ado, let's get into the video, shall we? Because I might be going on for a little bit a little bit of a long time, if that makes any sense. So yeah, whenever you're modding like any weapon, you're gonna have on your main damage mods, which are going to increase like basically all your stats. So this basically includes mods which will up your damage, that'll up your multi-shot, that'll up your fire rate with no diminishing returns or anything like that there. So for rifles, you'd be running Suression, Heavy Caliber, and Split Chamber. For your pistols, you would be running something like, let me just go ahead and equip a pistol here that would have like a decent build on, I would say. Yafuna, let's see, go ahead. For the Yafuna, you would be running on your Hornet Strike, Lethal Torrent, Barrel Diffusion. That's just for all pistols. And then for your melee, you would be running something like Pressure Point and Fury, or Pressure Point and Berserker, right? And that would be your main damage mods for like all three tiers of weapons, right? And from that point onwards, like you increase your stats, like that's like just the mods that you would use to increase your stats the most with like no negative effect, like no diminishing return, no negative effect would occur to your stats or anything like that there. It wouldn't like take up a mod slot, things like that there. There's no reason not to have those mods on that I literally just listed, unless like it has some negative effect, let's say on bows, where you become like too inaccurate and you take too big of a hit to your damage because like you need every single arrow to hit on the head or something. But other than that there, these are the mods that you should be running, right? Just for sake of keeping it simple on a rifle, let's say. So you'd have this is going to up your damage, and then from this point onwards, it might be a little bit confusing to you because you're like, okay, well, there's all these different damage types in the game. I've done my best to up my damage, things like that there. What do I do from here? So once you have these free mods on, it's kind of like, you can do anything you want, right? But it's not actually like that, because if you do anything you want, you may actually hurt your damage than help it, and that's why we use elemental mods. Now, I just wanted to explain the difference between elemental mods and physical damage type mods, because every single like form of damage in the game, be it impact, puncture, slash, fire, electricity, cold, corrosive, all those different things, they will all have positive and or negative effects versus every enemy within the game. And there's also like, different ways that your damage is calculated dependent on the mod that you put on. Now, I'm going to first explain why using physical damage types would be bad on a large majority of weapons, right? So physical damage types are basically your impact, puncture, and slash damage. And now you can see right here on my Bratton, these are very low values, right? How mods work within Warframe is they will take a percentage off the number that your weapon would be dealing, right? So let's say, it would take 5% of impact damage. If we were to go ahead and equip like an impact mod, it would take 5% of my impact damage and then add it on top of my original number, okay? And that's how, your mods would work. So like, let's say we have Suression, it would take 165% of my weapon's total damage, which you would get by adding up these three numbers, and then apply that there as extra damage, right? And that's how mods work in this game whenever it comes to adding more stats on, right? So it's bad to use physical damage type mods, which only increase like impact, puncture, or slash, because you'd only be increasing your damage in one area, where if you're using something like, let's say, a elemental mod, right? This is something I can show you guys. You're basically going to be able to get a percentage of all three of those damage numbers added up, or your total damage, because all three of these damage numbers added up is the total amount of damage that your weapon would be dealing in an ideal situation. Like, there's no resistances or weaknesses that come into play. Like, that would be the total amount of damage that you would deal. So it takes a percentage of these three numbers added up and then adds it on. So 90%, it takes 90% of these three numbers and then adds on as more damage. So then that adds to your total amount of damage in an ideal situation, right? So the best thing to do would be add on more elemental mods or use elemental combos. Now, elemental mods, they can have, like I said, or even just any damage type, for example, positive and or negative effects versus like different enemies within the game. So let's say we were shooting a guy with a shield, right? If we were shooting a guy with a shield with corrosive damage, we wouldn't be dealing much damage to him because they are resistant to corrosive damage because they have a shield on. We would be dealing less damage because we would have, or that enemy would have a resistance to that damage. So it would take like a certain percentage off our damage and then subtract that from the total amount of damage that we would be outputting otherwise, okay? So then it takes into effect other things like, you know, how much damage you would be dealing. Like, let's say you had something on like electric damage on that build or whatever, you know, even though that's kind of impossible because you couldn't have like, you know, toxin damage and electric damage in the same build without like making corrosive damage or whatever. But you know, it's just an example, right? So it electric damage would actually make you deal more damage to that shielded target, okay? And that's all percentage based as well. It would take a percentage of your damage and then apply that on. So 75% extra damage. It would add up all the values that you have on your weapons. So your impact, punch, or slash, and in our case, for the example, we would be talking about corrosive damage. It would take all of those stats and then it would take a percentage of that there. And then that would be added on as bonus damage to that enemy, right? So there is ideal and there is bad elemental combos that you could be running versus certain enemies, and you will have to make exceptions for certain enemies within a faction, but that's what this video is for, to kind of show you this is the best thing to use versus every single enemy in the faction. Now, if you don't understand how elemental comboing works in this game, I'm going to show that in this video as well. So completely strip your modding section down, okay? No mods, this is it. So up here in the top left hand corner, this is the first mod slot. To the right of that, your second. To the right of that, your third. To the right of that, your fourth. Down the bottom left, this is your fifth, your sixth, your seventh, and your eighth. So it goes in an order from top left down the bottom right, okay? So that would mean if you were to throw Infected Clip, which is our Toxin mod, Infected Clip, you go ahead and get it, Infected Clip here, in our first mod slot, and then we were to throw Stormbringer, right beside that, it would give us an elemental combo of corrosive damage. And I don't necessarily have to be beside one another, but this is important to note because this still makes corrosive damage, but if you get the order wrong and you were to put Heated Charge where my Stormbringer originally was, or not Heated Charge, sorry, Hellfire, that would make gas damage and electricity damage. So it's important to get the order right here, okay? And that would give us corrosive damage and fire damage because it's in the right order, which is the ideal setup versus the Grineer faction, or give or take. There's a few things that you could do here. This is just what I like to run versus the Grineer, but I'll talk about why in a second. So what you would be doing from this point onwards, you'd be getting your V polarity mods, or your main damage mods. You'd be throwing them back on, your Suration, your Heavy Caliber, and your Split Chamber. And this is what your build should be like if you're a newer player to the game. This is the optimal build that you would be running. Let's say your weapon doesn't have like a lot of crit chance or a lot of crit damage. This is the type of build you would be running, okay? So this is the build that I use versus the Grineer enemies, and the reason I do that there is because all the Grineer enemies have a lot of armor, and corrosive is good against certain types of armor within the game. So the majority of the Grineer enemies are actually, you know, weak to corrosive damage, and that's why we run this, especially the heavy gunners. Now, if you were to shoot a heavy gunner with corrosive damage, you would be dealing 75% extra damage, and then also from that Hellfire, you would get 25% more as well. So you'd be dealing 100% extra damage versus those heavy gunners, and that's 100% of the total damage that you're outputting. So that's a lot of damage right there. Now, whenever we're modding versus, you know, certain factions within the game, so there's 4 factions at the minute, or 5 if you include the Sentients, but that's kind of a spoiler a little bit, who aren't really weak to anything. So we're not going to talk about them. So there's 4 factions in the game that are worth talking about in this video. We have Grineer, we have Corpus, we have Infested, and we have the Corrupted, right? So this is the build that I use versus the Grineer, and this is a build that is good versus the Grineer Heavy Gunners, okay? Now, the other really threatening enemy within the Grineer faction is the Bombard, and how you would mod versus the Bombard is you'd put Stormbringer in your first slot, you'd throw Hellfire into your second slot, and then you would try to throw cryo rounds into your third slot. But now you can see why this is a little bit inefficient, because this does not match with the polarity that we have on there, therefore making it cost a lot more whenever it comes to just throwing it onto our modding section, meaning that we're going to lose out on some damage. The reason that you use corrosive versus the enemies in the Grineer faction is because the corrosive proc, or the corrosive status effect, which is determined how often it happens by your status chance on your weapon, will actually reduce enemy armor. Now, as I mentioned at the, near the beginning of the video, there is different types of armor within the game. So there's ferrite armor, there's alloy armor, and the bombards have alloy armor, and that's why they are weaker to radiation damage and cold damage. This would make you deal 100% extra damage versus the bombards. However, you would lose that damage versus the heavy gunners, you'd lose that damage versus the lancers and things like that there, and it would just start to fall off quicker than as if you were to use, your corrosive and fire in the Grenier faction, or versus the Grenier faction, right? So corrosive and fire is good, but if the bombards are really giving you trouble, you can go for radiation and cold. Generally, I recommend running corrosive and fire, or not corrosive and fire, yeah, corrosive and fire, which is your infected clip and your stormbringer, just to not get confused. Or you could alternatively also run corrosive and cold. This way you get 75% versus the heavy gunners and then 25% versus the bombards, which is fine as well. But as you can see, you're getting that polarities mismatch right there, which is really hurting you. Obviously, if you have extra polarities or something, you could throw cold damage on as well, and that would be totally fine, right? So moving on a little bit more, we can talk about the Corpus. Now, the Corpus are enemies who have shields, and literally all you have to do to beat the Corpus up is run magnetic and toxin damage, right? The reason we run magnetic and toxin damage is because every single enemy within the Corpus faction is capable of having a shield. Magnetic is good versus shields, and then toxin will actually damage enemies through their shields. It can do that via the toxin proc and just the damage in general. So, it's pretty good. You get 75% extra damage versus shields. The proc will reduce their maximum shield, and then the toxin will just damage your health even if they do have shields. So it's pretty good. It's pretty straightforward as well. But this is where things start to get a little bit complicated, and this is where people start to kind of argue with me with my methods with modding, right? Because they have a lot of questions. I wouldn't say they necessarily argue, but some people do. I don't understand why. But the Infested Faction, right? There are enemies within the Infested Faction called Ancients, and these Ancients are capable of actually giving armor to other infested units. There are a few infested units within the game that actually have armor as well, which can kind of just shed armor and stuff like that there, which is kind of cool. And obviously you need corrosive damage to deal more damage versus them as well. And the Ancients just take more damage versus corrosive to begin with, right? So people seem to always try to mod for the lighter units in the Infested Faction for some reason. I actually forget off the top of my head which is the best element to use versus the lower level enemies. I think it's either viral or gas. Can't really remember off the top of my head. But they always say you should be modding for this or you should be modding for that. And the reason that I don't mod for either of those two elemental combos is because corrosive is just going to deal more damage versus those ancient enemies who are capable of healing the other guys, like the little chargers and stuff. And then you have the 25% bonus damage from Hellfire versus the lighter units anyway. So, the infested guys, they don't have anything to sort of cock block your damage like that there. So that's why it's best to run corrosive and heat, because heat will damage your health by, again, you get 25% bonus. And then you get that corrosive damage in there to damage the ancients and kill them a lot faster too. So, that's why we run it like this here instead of running something else. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So finally, we're going to be talking about our Corrupted faction, which is the guys that you find in the Void, and you pretty much do the same thing as you do with the Grenier and the Infested, right? You run Corrosive and Fire, or you can run Corrosive and Cold, because the Corrupted, the guys in the Void, they are a mixture of every single enemy in the game. So corrosive damage is a must-have, and then personally, I like to run Corrosive and Cold versus them, but it's finding a weapon that kind of allows you to do that, right? So yeah, Corrosive and Fire is usually your safest option. And if you're super lazy, mod around having Corrosive and Cold damage on every single your weapon, because cold damage, you get 25% versus shields, you get 25% versus bombards, and then corrosive damage is pretty much good against every single thing, or almost everything else in the game. So, for the lazy man who doesn't want to bother forming his weapons every single time, run Corrosive and Cold, and that's really all the advice I can give you. You will start to notice that you'll fall off a little bit faster than your friends who can actually be asked to go through the configs and stuff. But yeah, that's basically a breakdown do elemental modding within Warframe. You have 2 extra slots there, which you could throw things on, like status chance mods, crit mods, quality of life mods, things like that there. Status chance is basically just the percentage chance to proc an effect coming from one of your damage types. So the damage type that has the most damage on your weapon, so in my case right now corrosive, is the most likely to be procced out of the, I think it's 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, out of the 5 damage types that you have on. So if I were to have a higher stat chance of 100%, almost 99.9% of the time, I would be proccing like corrosive damage. I'm not too sure how it's like divided up or what determines, like, I know the highest damaging element or the highest damaging, or the highest number of damage is going to be applied via status. But I'm not too sure how it's determined like everything else from that there point onwards, or how it's like equally divided up between the status. I'm pretty sure it's like the status chance then divided by 5 or however many elements you have on, something like that there. And yeah, it's confusing, it's complicated, but all you need to know is that status is good when, you're relying on your status procs to kill enemies, like weaken them for you. Other than that there, you want to be running your 90% mods to deal higher damaging numbers and stuff like that there. If an enemy is stripped of all the resistances, like let's say for example you're running 4 corrosive projections in your team and the enemies have no armor, maybe they have no shields, you want to be running viral damage because the viral proc will reduce the enemy's maximum health, and it's also pretty good against flesh as well. So yeah, that's what you want to do, and that is basically it, guys. That's elemental damage explained. So if you guys have any more questions, feel free to leave a comment down in the comment section below. Let me know, ask me in stream. I usually stream from 12 p.m. UK time up until around maybe 4 or 5 p.m. So yeah, thanks for watching this video, guys. If you like it, hit like, and if you want to see more Warframe content from me, hit subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.